So if we look into the newer version, the R3 version, that is actually used by many countries today if we look at what we get for the WHO program. So for this format, it's specified that you should submit MPID when you have it available. If you don't have an MPID, you should try to submit the PhPID if you have that available. And the PhPID can then be linked to different MPIDs compositions. There's also a product name part, such as trade name, that should be reported if the MPID is not identifiable. And there's also a substance ID that should be used when no PhPID exists. And in the worst case scenario, if you don't have an MPID, a PhPID or a substance ID, you could submit the substance as free text if you know anything about the substance. So I said that there are many countries that are using R3 today. However, these IDs, as we all know, doesn't exist yet. So what we still get is, in principle, according to the R2 format. So drug name and ingredient in free text. Next slide, please. So when we today then get information about the substance or product name, in principle, we have to do coding of this information. Luckily, at the UMC, we have the WHO Drug Dictionary, which is a global dictionary. So we use auto encoding or manual coding of all these reports. It's, however, sometimes very challenging because they are, of course, misspellings, both to trade names and substance level names. And it's making it really hard sometimes to identify the product or substance that was used. So when we have identified the substance in the signal detection, we today aggregate all data on the substance level. And in WHO Drug, the substance level is similar to in IDMP, linked to the product name. So what we can do then is, after a signal is identified, we usually expand the search to see if there are more reports on other products with the same substance. And it could be with different formulations, different pharmaceutical form, or different strength. All this data is today manually reviewed by looking up information in, for example, SMPCs, in order to find details about, for example, form or strength and the indication of the drug. Next slide, please. So after this manual review, some products may be excluded because we could not find any additional data that supported that the effect was seen from these particular products. Next slide. So in the future then, having a PhPID reported could give a new and better opportunity to analyze the data faster and with improved granularity. By searching the substance related to a particular reported PhPID and the related adverse events, one may find additional cases. And by having the information represented by the PhPID, it will be much simpler to investigate and cluster the cases and decide if the new cases should belong to the same case area or not, and if it's a dose-related reaction, which is quite often the case. Today, if we look at the data we have, 70% of the drugs on the reports have a substance specified, and only 40% have the dose form specified. So we are hoping upon implementation of PhPID that reports will have more detail that actually can help us with faster identification and also improving the analysis. Next slide, please. As you all know, there are always these difficult cases. So for example, we have generic drugs which express the strength in different ways. And these are quite hard to interpret. You really have to go deep into the information about the drug. So if the strength expressions were more harmonized, this would really improve the analysis and make it faster. Next slide, please. So what's the benefits then of the global PhPID in safety surveillance? Well, it would improve the quality of the data collected, and it would increase the ability to search and analyze the data, and hopefully also get faster identification of the safety issues. And this is also on a regional basis, because each country, of course, do their own safety surveillance. And they are usually the ones that can do the really quick surveillance. So this would be very beneficial within each country as well. Next slide, please. So there is, however, a risk that's been noted for the E2B-R3 implementation, and that's the local variants of the IDs. So for example, if we have local assignments of the substance IDs, or if we have local assignments of PhPIDs, or even local variations of the PhPID algorithm, there will be, a lack of harmonization, and we kind of lose the benefit on a global level. Of course, this would work on a regional level, but on the global level, we would be in a similar situation as we are today. Next slide, please. So, as you know, then it would be very beneficial to have a global source of the PhPIDs, and it's been ongoing discussions for many years how to solve this. But last year, WHO proposed that UMC would take on the responsibility for the day-to-day operations connected to a global PhPID. So WHO UMC would in that case maintain the PhPIDs using the business rules based on the IDMP algorithm and according to the ISO 14872 technical report, which is describing the core operating principles and the proposed service delivery model for terminology maintenance services. In this proposal, an international working group led by WHO could oversee the issues or the potential issues related to the PhPID assignments. And all users, both regulators and industry, should be able to request and use the global PhPIDs. UMC already today provide an application for requesting new drugs to be entered into WHO drug, and or to request changes to, for example, substances, form or strength in the dictionary. We know that it will be very challenging to generate global PhPIDs, but we think that they have a good experience when we are today working with the WHO drug dictionary. We are actually validating this kind of information every single day. But as all of you know, it's not straightforward to generate the PhPID. There are some issues that need to be resolved, but I think some of these will be looked into during the UNICOM project. And Leonora will give you some examples of some of these issues later on in her presentation related to dictionaries. But to end this presentation, I would simply say that for pharmacovigilance, just having a global substance ID is a true benefit that would improve analysis and make safer patients. So that was my part, and now over to Leonora and dictionaries. Thank you.
You have to unmute, Leonora.
Sorry. Thank you, Malin, and thank you also, Christian, for having me in this session. My name is Leonora Grandia. I'm working at Z-Index, which is part of the Dutch Pharmacist Organization, and we develop and publish the Dutch drug database in the Medicinal Product Dictionary. Can I have the next slide, please? So as Malin said, the PHP and IDMP, also the other parts of the IDMP, are very useful for the pharmacovigilance. And it was actually also the scope of developing the IDMP standards that it should support the pharmacovigilance use case. But pharmacovigilance has its roots in healthcare. The pharmacovigilance starts when a doctor prescribes a medicine, or when a patient goes to the drugstore and buys a medicine. And when an adverse reaction occurs, then you have your use case for the pharmacovigilance. But it means that IDMP is also very important for the part of the healthcare. And you can see it in this picture. Left under is the circle of the developing of the IDMP. But the IDMP standards and the identifications should be included in a medicinal product dictionary, which can be used in healthcare for all type of processes that should be done in healthcare. So let us have a closer look to the medicinal product dictionary in the next slide. Where you can see what is the place of a medicinal product dictionary in the broader area of healthcare. And there are many countries who have a medicinal product dictionary or drug dictionary, and it has many functions. When we look to, for example, our case in the Netherlands, we have a medicinal product dictionary with licensed drugs, with unlicensed drugs, and it is used for supply chain, for ordering the drugs, for prescribing, for dispensing, for reimbursement, and for nearly all processes in healthcare. The medicinal product dictionary is used. Can I please have the next slide? And when we look to the use cases for a medicinal product dictionary, there are several. The first one, or an important one, is for prescribing, especially for generic prescription. So if you would like to prescribe on a generic level, it is very useful to have an abstract level of the drugs. So not just only the medicinal product, but also, for example, the pharmaceutical product, so that you don't have to prescribe triptizol, but that you can prescribe amitriptyline tablet 10 milligram, and the pharmacist can choose which medicinal product he will dispense. Another use case on the next slide is, for example, the generic substitution. When a doctor prescribes the drug on a generic level, so on the level of the pharmaceutical product, when a patient gets, firstly, for example, brand A, but he has to switch to brand B because of the reimbursement. The first medicinal product is no longer reimbursed, so he has to switch to another one. Or there is another reason, and maybe an adverse event on one of the excipients. The PhP gives the possibility to see which medicinal products are exchangeable within the same product that is prescribed. So the PhP can support the use case of the substitution in healthcare. Another use case on the next slide is to support the linkage of decision support to your medicinal product dictionary. There are medicinal product dictionaries that have just the level of the medicinal product. But there are also medicinal product dictionaries that have a hierarchical structure or a backbone or abstract levels of the drugs. So that you not only have the level of the medicinal product, but also of the pharmaceutical product and of the substance. And when you would like to have a linkage between decision support and your backbone of your medicinal product dictionary, it is, of course, very efficient to do that on, and to make such a linkage or a mapping on a higher abstract level. If you have, for example, 20,000 medicinal products, it is not very efficient to make a link with your decision support to all the different 20,000 products, but you would like to do it on a level of the substance, and all the medicinal products will have the same type of decision support. So especially for that use case, for a linkage between decision support, a kind of backbone or the abstract levels of the drugs, which are supported by IDMP, are very useful. Can I please have the next slide? Yeah. But having said this, that IDMP has the pharmaceutical product, which is an abstract level of the of your medicinal product, which is also useful in healthcare. There is the issue that the IDMP is especially developed for the pharmacovigilance and for the exchange of data between the national competent authorities and the pharmaceutical industry. And in healthcare, the use cases can be slightly different, and at least it is a different context. For example, when you use the pharmaceutical product for prescribing, doctors are not interested in the different salts. They are not interested whether something is a tablet film coated, a tablet coated, or just a tablet. And for generic substitution, characteristics like a narrow therapeutic index are also important, but are now part of the pharmaceutical product. So it can be the case that the usage of an abstract level in healthcare needs something different than the abstract level of the present PhP for the use case of the pharmacovigilance and the exchange of information between the pharmaceutical industry and the national, how to say it, the NCAs. Can I have the next slide, please? But imagine that these two type of use cases cover the same things that you need, and that they are reconciled, and there is no conflict between the use case in pharmacovigilance and the use case in healthcare. Then still there are questions for the implementation of the PhP in your medicinal product dictionary. The first question is, what is the model for your local medicinal product dictionary? Do you have a backbone or abstract levels, or you don't have at all? If you don't have abstract levels, maybe you can just use the PhP as it is on top of your medicinal product identifier. But if you have a backbone, how might the PhP map to your existing backbone? And how can you benefit from maybe the extra data in the PhP that you don't have in your backbone, or maybe you have extra abstract levels that are not in the PhP. So you should figure out how these two can map together. Where are the gaps that you have to bridge, and how can you benefit from the PhP? Can I have the next slide, please? And last but not least, when you have such a mapping, so when the use cases are reconciliated and you have done a mapping, then still it is very important what are the rules by which the PhP are developed or created. For example, when you would like to use the PhP as a level for generic prescription, is the dose form indeed film-coated tablet? in the PHP, or is a higher level used that just say a tablet? Because for prescription, a tablet is more useful than saying a film-coated tablet and such small differences in the types of dose form that are not interesting for the prescriber. And another thing is, for example, you have a liquid. Is then the unit of presentation, is it milliliter, or is also gram allowed? For prescriber, he thinks it is a liquid, so he expects milliliter and not gram. And for example, liquid in unit dose, is it expressed as X milligram per each, per sachet or per pre-filled syringe? Or is it expressed as X milligram per ml and so many milliliter per each? And for the usage in healthcare, it can be different whether it is expressed in one or in another way, and at least it should be done consistently. And maybe there's difference how to do that for the oral drugs compared to the parenteral drugs. And another example is the patch. Do you express it as X milligram per each, or do you say no? For healthcare, it is important to know the rate of how to say it, how many milligram per hour. So we express a patch in the unit milligram per hour. And there are many other of this type of things that are important for healthcare. How are the drugs expressed? So what are the rules for the PHP in order to make it useful for the usage in healthcare? Next slide, please. So when I summarize the place of the PHP in healthcare and in the medicinal product dictionary, I think an abstract level like the PHP will be very useful in healthcare for the several use cases that I explained. But it should be figured out whether the different scope of the PHP for the pharmacovigilance and for healthcare exactly fit together, or whether there are gaps to be bridged between those two. And it is depending on the structure of your medicinal product dictionary, whether there are, what are the points to consider for the implementation of the PHP in your medicinal product dictionary. And the last point that I explained lastly is that it is important that there should be clear rules for the creation of the PHP in order that you have a consistent PHP, which also should be useful for healthcare. And and with this summary, I would like to close my presentation and hand it over to Giorgio.
Thank you, Leonora. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Giorgio Cangioli. I'm a consultant and I'm representing here HL7 Europe. As you probably know, HL7 is an international standard development organization. Malin and Leonora provided a very interesting presentation about some of the usage of PhPID. What I would like to do here is to address this important question: for which purpose, from a wider perspective. Next slide, please. For doing that, I hope you don't mind if I try to make a step back and try to restart from some basic question. Probably we have discussed this question several times, above all for those that have been involved directly or indirectly with open medicine or UNICOM. The question are, for example, are the IDPM identifier useful outside the regulatory context? Next, do we really need this other set of code outside the regulatory context? And will the IDMP substitute the other identifier? Next slide, please. it's clear that we all know that IDMP has been designed for regulatory purposes, but it's also, we are all aware that the capability of IDMP of tracking the product along all its life cycle and potentially also across different contexts of use is for sure an additional value for the IDMP identifier. And somehow this has been already recognized implicitly also. I tried to report a piece of technical standard in which it's clear that the PhPID are supposed also to support the prescribing the activity. It could be a very, provide, as I told before, an added value in that context. And this is also what was recognized by the Open Medicine project. Next slide. So the problem of if we really need this other code, if you talk, and I'm sure that you had the same experience with most of the user, it happens often that if you, the problem of identifying a product is a sort of not a problem. It's an easy thing to do. And there are a quite smooth way to convey this information in some of the most relevant standards. The problem is that this is also somehow true, but is it true? Next slide, please. Is it true if you actually think locally? In fact, next slide. What is happening if you try to cross a border? Next. Crossing a border doesn't mean only to move across countries. It could mean move across different jurisdictions that could be not a single country, but means also to move across different usage contexts. Next slide, please. And it is clear that the solution that we have discussed before is not appropriate in this context. And I would like also to enforce the fact that as we learn also from the COVID situation, crossing the border, whatever the border is not only a sort of academic exercise. So I don't want to bother you about why that local solution is not appropriate. We know that a product code could identify different kind of tea, could be a packaged product, could be a cluster of product, could be a substance, and is not sure that that code could be recognized from the receiver. Next slide, please. The problem becomes even more complex if we consider, for example, that the jurisdiction and context of use are cross-border, are combined. So, next. What is the usual approach, or what are the possible solutions to try to resolve that? These are two not mutually exclusive options. We can rely on some global identifier code to try to address that. We can try to provide a set of identifying attributes that try to describe the product, and this is somehow the current approach used for the cross jurisdiction. But one of the questions next is, what are the characteristics? Any global identifier fit for that purpose, or we should have identifier that have some specific characteristic? Next slide. So, if we would like to have useful global identifier that fulfill the objective that we have described before, we need to have identifier that should be timely available, means that we cannot have a code or identifier that is available 6 months or 1 year later that the product has been released on the market. It should be usable anywhere for anyone without freely usable, I would say. And it should be also easy maintainable, means that should not cost to the organization complex mapping exercise or ex-post reconciliation. Next. If we would like to try to achieve all these requirements, it's clear that need to be ID that should come directly from the registration process and made available, as described before by Leonora, through the MPD. And there can be linked to other global or local code, or can be used to retrieve also other product detail. Next slide. In that sense, the IDMP identifier seems to perfectly fit for that purposes. And this is also what was one of the results of the medicine that suggests to link locally used code to the closest IDMP identifier, trying to provide at least the PhPID. Next slide. The idea, however, is not to have this ID that will substitute the other identifier, but to use this ID to integrate it, to enable a better exchange of information across different contexts, so to facilitate the cross of this border that we have identified before. Next slide. So, having said that, we may say that we have the direction where we should go. We also know that, as already mentioned by Leonora and Malin, that there is a lot of work that needs to be done. And just to mention a few things, next slide. There are a set of gaps that has been also identified by UNICOM. I tried to mention that the need of having maybe other strata of PHP to represent less or more specific PhPID-like concept. Next one, in terms of, for example, implementing in the different standard, how we should represent them, this set of multiple code. There are different approaches that could be followed, each of them with pro and contra. We can treat them as a flat list of code, and this is the approach that is currently suggested in the HL7 Fire community. Or we can try to map the different IDMP classes in the different classes of the model. And for example, this is the approach that is followed in the CDA implementation of the International Patient Summary. So these are all things that need to be addressed, will be for sure part of the UNICOM work, and I really hope, we hope that this thing could be moved forward also with your help and contribution. Thanks a lot. Next slide. And I'll give the floor back to Christian. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Giorgio. Thank you to all three presenters. We received a few questions through the Q&A and the chat box. From the chat box, I would say, unless I'm mistaken, most of the questions have been answered directly. I'm just noting that Kevin was asking something about the substance management, and that has received an answer. And that's it, I think. Oh yeah, and PhPID calculated based on the active ingredient? No, it is based on the substances, which includes the active ingredient, but not only. In the chat box, the Q&A, which I recommend you to use to ask your question, because that enables also to keep track of them. Stefan has asked one very specific question first. Who can we contact for assistance regarding E2B R3 submission? And I don't know if somebody from the presenter can answer that.
This is Malin. I mean, it depends on what kind of assistance they would need. I don't know if it's about the guidelines. I think you need to contact the ones writing the guidelines. But if it's more of how you in practice use the format, UMC usually assist authorities with that.
Okay.
I don't know if there are others that assist in that.
No, at least you have two directions possible depending on the way you look at your question and expect the answer. The second question from the same Stefan: wouldn't additional data points serving healthcare be irrelevant to the data exchange provisions by IDMP? It is perhaps difficult to justify the extra effort required by the industry to enter this data. Do you have any thoughts on that? I hope the question is clear enough to receive an answer. Maybe Leonora?
Yeah. I think there are several things. I think the first thing is that in most cases, the data already in IDMP are just too detailed for healthcare. So what I said, that for prescribing the salt isn't important, but of course for the identification and the calculation of the salt and base, it is very important. But for the usage of PHP and also the MPID in healthcare, it is more about leaving out details than adding information. So that's the one thing, and the information that should be added because you need it in healthcare is, I think, partly on the non-approved data. For example, what we have in our database is that you can indicate the route of administration when you prescribe a drug, but it can also be a route of administration that is not approved, but which is in our national guidelines. So from that perspective, although you need some extra data, that are not data that can come from the industry because they don't have the data or they are not responsible for the data. And other things that I mentioned, like the narrow therapeutic index, when you would like to support the use case of the substitution. I don't think that these are data that you would like to ask from the pharmaceutical industry, but that it is the a pharmaceutical organization, or at least a scientific organization, that will add that type of information to you with this product dictionary in order to make it useful for healthcare. So I don't think that for bridging the gap between pharmacovigilance and pharmaceutical industry to healthcare, that industry need to do something more than that they are doing now. But that's my opinion.
I appreciate the response. I have a couple of other questions which have been risen in between. Marcello, are there restrictions for MPID generation as for the PhPID level 1, 2, 3, or 4? I'm not sure I understand what he means with restriction, but constraint maybe would be the term I would better understand. Well, or if I formulate that reverse, maybe PhPID is used to generate an MPID, medicinal product identification. Now, if this is a PhPID level 1, 2, 3, or 4, how does it impact the calculation of the MPID? Who wants to answer that?
Yeah, I don't know whether I understand it correctly, but for the PHP, there are a set of characteristics that identify the PHP. So in that way, there are restrictions, but the same for the MPID. There are a lot of more characteristics, but it are the fixed characteristics that form the MPID. But I don't know whether that is an answer on the question.
I hope apparently there is something in addition. Yes, so I was translating that correctly. Marcello, you may write in the Q&A if you're happy with the answer, would be helpful. Once you do that, I go to the next one, which is a comment from Lise. She said that pharmacovigilance does not begin at post-marketing. Actually, it begins already in the clinical trial phase, since safety and efficacy are required before approval. The experience of pre versus post-market adverse events are relevant for changes in the product formulation or labeling.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a comment.
Yeah. I left out that perspective.
Yeah. Jump to another question. How will the calculation of PhPID consider products with transformations? So, for instance, powder for solution, for injection or infusion?
Yeah, that's part of the definition of the dose form. So in the PHP, it is oh, now I need to say it by heart. It is the transformed dose form, and in the MPID, it is the manufactured dose form. So it is considered that there is difference between the manufactured dose form and that there need to be make a transformation sometimes to solve a powder in a solution. And it is captured on the different levels in the IDMP.
I hope that answered the question, Gunhild. And okay, you have thumb up, that's good. I think there was another
comment of Lies.
Sorry?
There's nog another comment of Lies.
But she has already thumb up, so I suppose it is solved. But she said, in reference to the PhPID algorithm, I think we should consider the need for related allergy information, which may have a relationship with other characteristics, such as flavoring or coloring agents. Support the need for a generic ID, but we do need to be sure to do reference to the packaged product, which is more granular. This is what the regulator do.
Agree.
Yeah, that's great. On the chat box, that was on the Q&A. On the chat box, I noted a comment from Robert. Where is that? Here. Robert says, IDMP provides both global identifiers and standardizes the national description of the medicinal product in a universal way. Maybe, Giorgio, you want to comment this? Because that's the combination of the global local.
Yes, I mean that the fact is that it's true that could provide a way, as we described before, to provide a standardization of the way the national description are provided. But we need to have a way to continue to manage it if you have local identifier to associate this local identifier with the global ID. And for sure, it helps if you are talking about the different characteristics to standardize how the different things are described. The dose form or the other thing that describe the product.
Thank you. I saw a couple of questions and comments regarding substance. And substance, as we saw in the very beginning of this afternoon call, substance ID is necessary to generate or to calculate, PhPID. The idea is to have a global substance identification maintenance. Malin was mentioning this for pharmaceutical product identifier, but it is same for substance ID. There are discussions to have this substance ID management hosted by WHO UMC. It is certainly better, as writes Herman, better to try to get a global ID maintained by one single organization rather than map several regional ID, which is certainly difficult and possibly error prone as well. as we know, human intervention is not optimal. I see that I have another question in my chat box. I cannot read it yet, but okay. I think this is okay like this. It doesn't impact us. What comes here? Yeah. So these are comments regarding the global substance ID. In that context, maybe I tell you already that in 2 months, if I'm not mistaken, the next community of expertise, so it will be in November, will address pilot project substance list, which has been developed by UNICOM experts. Some of them are in the attendance here. And that is a great job, because it will enable that one demonstrates how IDMP works, not only in the regulatory space, but also in the clinical space. So the transition to additional use of IDMP, certainly not as a standalone, but completing the information. So watch this space for the next call we have.
I see that there is another question from Liz in the chat.
That's a question for you, by the way.
Yeah. So if you are referring to the capability of providing more code, is codable concept allowed to include more coding in which you may have translational, quasi-translation of the same concept? If this was the question. So you may have, if you have different code for the same thing, you can provide all of them in the same element, if it is a codable concept.
I hope that
you have a local code and the IDMP code in the same, for the same element, if this was the question.
Okay. Now, the Q&A is full of surprise. Let me jump to this one. The PhPID will be calculated on controlled terms by an algorithm. Am I right that no manual interaction will be needed, also on global level? He means no manual action to create that PhPID. Maybe Malin, you can answer that, because you are the most trained for this.
Yeah. I think in the ideal case, and if everyone is using exactly the same standardized terminologies, if we have the global substance IDs and everyone is using this, yes, I guess that would be the case. But I think we have a very long way to go to reach that goal. So I think meanwhile, if we want to have global PhPIDs, I think in certain cases we will need manual interventions. And that's what UMC are proposing, that they could handle those together with a working group from WHO, where different experts are assigned.
Thank you. We are narrowing the hour. It's 1 minute before, so as you have seen, I have opened the questionnaire, which is a very simple one. I'm very grateful if you can tick your answer, which takes probably only 1 minute. And during that, I want to thank the speaker we had this afternoon for their preparation and engagement to share their experience and knowledge. And I want also to thank all the participants. And with nearly 100 participants, this is a good result, although we don't measure the quality with the quantity. But we are very happy that we had so many participants today, and we hope to have the same. Next time, because we fear we may exceed the 100 limits, we will post live the webinar on YouTube, and you will receive also the link for that. But at that time, we will not be able to ask questions. The webinar, this community of expertise, is part of what UNICOM Work Package 1 wants to do is to share what we know with the implementer community in the widest sense, and also to collect from your questions what are the points which are open for you, and that would be something where we should deliver either a concrete answer or integrate in our thoughts for more documentation and better documentation. Voila, I'm going to close the call. We have 53 voters, still a few missing. Please complete this very quick questionnaire so that we understand how the things are working. I wish you a good afternoon. For many of us, it is very close to the weekend, and I wish you an excellent weekend and keep safe in this difficult time. Goodbye and thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.